The Other Side of the Door, by Lucia Chamberlain. Prologue. The City. The city is always gray. Even in March, the greenest month of all, when the Presidio and the Mission Hills and the islands in the bay are beautiful with spring, there's only such a little bit of green gets into the city. It lies in the lap of 5 hills, climbing upward toward their crests where the trees are all doubled and bent by the trade wind. It seems to give its own color to the growing things in it. The cypress hedges are dusty black. The eucalyptus trees are gray as the house fronts they knock against, and even the plaza grass looks dark and old, as if it had been the same grass always, and never came up new in the spring. But for the most part there are no trees, and only the finest places have gardens. There are only rows and rows of houses painted gray, with here and there a white one, or a glass conservatory front. But the fog and dust all summer gray these too, and when the trade winds blow hard it takes the smoke out over the East Bay and makes that as gray as the city. And yet the city doesn't look sad. The sky is too blue, and the bay is too blue around it, and the flying fog, and the wind, and the strong tide flowing in and out of the bay are like restless, eager creatures that never sleep or grow tired. When I was a very little child the fierceness of it frightened me. All the noises of the city made one harsh, threatening voice to my ears, and the perilous water encompassing far as eye could reach, and the high hills running up into the sky now blinded by dust, now buried in fog, now drenched in rain, were overpowering and terrifying to me. Beyond that general seeming of terror, there is little I remember of the early city, except the glimmer of white tent tops against gray fog or blue water, the loud voices in the streets, and a vague general impression of rapid and violent changes of place and circumstance. Through their confusion 3 figures only move with any clearness: my tall, teasing father, my grim nurse Abby, and my pale-haired mother. Indeed, the first distinct incident that stands forth from that dim background is the death of my mother. It was a puzzle for a child. One day she was there, ill in bed, but visible, palpable, able to speak, to smile, to kiss. The next she had disappeared. They said she had gone away, but I knew that was nonsense. For when people went away it was in the daytime with bags and umbrellas, and everyone knew they were going, and where they went. But with my mother it was different. One day she was there, the next she was not, nor in any of the rooms of the house could she be found. It was long before I ceased to expect her back, long before I ceased, by some process of child's reasoning, to blame her departure on the gray, unaccountable city. For as early as I can recall a coherent sequence of impressions the city appeared to me strange and unaccountable. There was a secret shut away from me behind every closed house front. The eucalyptus trees seemed to whisper mystery above my head. And at night when the fog came heaping in, thicker than feather beds, across the Mission, and streaming down the long hills on the heels of the wind, it brought an army of ghosts to inhabit the dark places beyond the safety of the lighted window pane. Though I had lived among the 7 hills almost all my life, and though in ways it had grown familiar and even dear to me, yet I never seemed to grow quite used to the city. It had strange tricks of deception that were enough to unsettle the finest faith. For when I looked at it from the windows of my room under the roof it was as flat as a plate, visible in its entirety from end to end, and it was as easy to find Telegraph Hill or the Plaza upon it as it was to pick up a block from the carpet. But when I went abroad in it, it hid away from me. It would never show me more than one street at a time, and never by any chance would it reveal to me, through the tall houses, in what part of it I was walking. But by the time I was old enough to play in the garden by myself and make friends through the hedge with Hallie Ferguson, who lived a block below us, I had come to accept this trick of the city as somewhat less extraordinary. It was developing other characteristics not so fearful to my mind, and of far greater fascination, and I spent hours, when I could not be out of doors, watching it from the windows of my room. Father had built what was at the time one of the finest houses in San Francisco. It had a glass conservatory at the side, and a garden with a lawn and palm in the corner, and on rainy nights when the wind was high and the house was shaking, I could hear the long palm fingers tapping on my window glass. The house stood halfway up Washington Street hill, on what was then the western skirts of the city, and from my window under the roof I could look down over the whole city to the east water front, with Rincon Hill misty on the south, and Telegraph bold on the north of it. By leaning far out of the window, as Hallie and I sometimes did when a ship was coming in, we could see northward as far as North Beach and Alcatraz Island, and from Abby's room across the hall we could continue the panorama around to Russian Hill, whose high crown cut off the Golden Gate. It was a favorite game of ours, hanging out the window, with our heads in the palm leaves, to pretend stories of what we saw going on in the city beneath. All sorts of strange and interesting things went on in the city. We could see the signals run up on Telegraph Hill when a ship was sighted, and then the express would go dashing furiously down some street below us, the pony at gallop, and the line would form in front of the post office and stretch like a black snake up Washington Street. Or we watched the yellow omnibuses laboring down Washington Street like clumsy beetles. It seemed to me that a city was the most delightful and absorbing plaything a child could have, and it was a hard arbitrary blow of fate that took me from it to the convent school at Santa Clara. But if to leave the city was hard, it was terrible indeed to leave the house, the familiar rooms, the familiar footsteps and voices that I loved and listened for. I had never been away from Father and Abby in my life, and though Hallie Ferguson and Estrella Mendez went also, I was very homesick. There was nothing at all interesting at the convent, nothing but pepper trees and nuns' black hoods and books. Even when we walked out there was only the dreary Santa Clara Flats with the mountains so distant on the horizon that their far-awayness made me want to cry. The only nice thing about the convent was the vacation that took us away from it, back out of the burning summer valley to the bay, the rows of gray-faced houses, the shipping and the wind. Each time I came back it was with the rapture one must feel returning to some long-left beloved place and finding it unchanged. The palm, the cypress hedges, the sunny conservatory, the low, long rooms beyond it, the dark hall, and narrow, precipitous stair were always adorably the same. But around them the city was growing with such speed that each time I returned I had to learn to know it afresh. Already there were several blocks of houses beyond ours, and the second year I came home from the convent Hallie Ferguson told me her father was going to move because there was a gambling house going up across the street from them, and build, Hallie expressed it, in a more fashionable neighborhood. It was at the foot of Chestnut Street Hill their new house was building, and that vacation we used often to walk over with Abby, Estrella, Hallie, and I, across the city and across the North Beach district, to play in the building house. It was going up with the same furious speed that was accomplishing the whole city. It seemed that we had hardly stopped looking through the skeleton supports at the bay before the plaster was drying on the solid walls, that we had hardly ceased walking on the great naked flooring beams before the smooth floor itself was palpitating under the feet of the dancers at the house-warming. I remember sitting up with Hallie through the earlier part of that evening, and with a sort of worship, looking for the first time at women with uncovered necks and arms, emerging white as wax from their diaphanous or glittering gowns. To me they were radiant, transported to a sphere of existence beyond my own, something I never would attain to. I recall them as a vague, dreamlike spectacle. In all of it there is but one incident that I remember clearly, and that is, when whirling out of the crowd and into an empty space that the dancers had left clear for a moment, came a couple, a large blonde girl and a young man, a boy, hardly as old as she, but so handsome, so dark, so full of life, and a sparkling sort of mischief, that it made one feel quite gay just to look at him. As they danced past the place where Hallie and I were sitting, he was holding his partner's gauzy train in his long, fine fingers, and they went by us laughing. "Who is that?" I whispered. "That's Johnny Montgomery," Hallie whispered back. "Who's he?" "Why, don't you know?" Hallie cried. She dearly loved to give information. "The Montgomerys were one of the very best families here, and he's the last of them. Old Lady Montgomery died the year we went away to school, and he had heaps of money, but he lost it." My sole performance in this line had been the dropping of a 2-bit piece down a crack in the board walk, and before I had time to ask how Johnny Montgomery had managed to lose sight of heaps, Mr. Ferguson came up and asked, "Don't you little girls want some ice cream?" So I forgot to say any more about it. That same season there was another notable occasion, when Hallie led me to the bedroom of her grown-up sister, and exhibited to me with awestruck pride the dress her sister was to wear to the Summer Light Guards ball that night. It was a blue tulle with a fine frost of spangles over the bodice, and it seemed too dazzling to belong to a creature less wonderful than a fairy. But when Hallie went on, in a cautious whisper lest we be discovered, to confide to me that when she was grown up and out of school her mother had promised to give her a party, and that since I was her best friend, of course she was going to invite me first of all, I began to realize that I, too, might some day grow up into a young lady, and be laced into a gown perhaps as beautiful as the one spread out on the bed before us. Such a dazzling idea gave me an entirely new set of fancies, and was a pleasant book companion and bedfellow to take back to the convent. Hallie, who was a year older and half a head taller than I, had already begun to lengthen her dresses and to do up her hair, and I found it humiliating to be so small that at 16 I had still to wear mine down my back in long curls, and my skirts above my ankles. The only thing that comforted me was that whenever father came to see me he always said, "Child, how tall you are! You're almost a woman." And though he was the one person who seemed to think so, it was quite sufficient for me. When my graduation day came I was much excited to think how absolutely grown up I would appear to him in my first long frock. But when I came to him after the exercises were over, he looked at me as if he were sad, and said, "Child, how little you are." That was a dreadful disappointment to me. But when I reminded him how he had always told me I was tall, he laughed and said, "You were tall for a schoolgirl, but you're very little to be mistress of a house." That puzzled me, but on the way home, driving up through the valley, he told me more about what he meant. He said, "Now that you have stopped being a child, you are going to be a very gay young lady, going to have fine gowns, and dance about like a butterfly, and you're going to keep on being my little girl. But at the same time I'm afraid you will have to be a little lady of the house, too, and take care of me and Abby, now that Abby's rheumatism is so bad, and go to call on the ladies who were your mother's friends and are going to be yours. Do you think you are tall enough to do all that?" I was so surprised and so happy that I hugged him right there in the buggy and said, "Do you really mean it?" Father laughed, just as he does to cover up being rather serious, and said, "You are your mother's daughter, for she was a little fair woman, but there was never anything too big for her to manage." I was happier than ever to hear him say that. He so seldom spoke of mother; and the idea of a whole house to manage, and of sitting at the foot of the table, and calling on grown-up married women seemed to me as merry and exciting as going to parties and having beaux. I had not been in the city for a year, spending my last vacations at the ranch at Menlo Park, and though I knew from what Hallie had told me that the city was very different, yet when I got out of the buggy in front of the house the look of the street startled me. For a moment even the house seemed strange. But that was only because the other houses were all about it. As far as one looked up the hill there was nothing but thick houses, and queer little shops were crowding up the block so close that we had the appearance of being almost downtown. Even inside the house looked different. but quite beautifully different, done over with lovely fresh papers and Japanese mattings. But what touched and pleased me most of all was to find the picture of mother, which had used to hang over father's dressing table, now in my room, above my bed. "You need it now more than I do," he said, and though I couldn't see just why I needed it, I loved to look at it. The amusing part of it was that mother in the picture was holding me, a little me, a baby 2 years old. Myself would never look out at me. But mother looked always, with the same half brave, half timid glance, when, sitting on the bed, I made her my confidences. With all my new responsibilities and my new clothes, I felt as if I had somehow been "done over" too. Yet it was surprising how quickly I became used to the patter of my long petticoats around my feet as I walked, the weight of all my hair upon my head, and my stately pouring of the tea at the foot of the dinner table. Father's friends were always coming in and out, and staying to luncheon or dinner, and with their high silk hats, their elegant bows to me, and their laughing at things I said which were not in the least funny, at first they confused me not a little. But I grew accustomed to them too. I grew even to like them. Especially Mr. Dingley, father's greatest friend, who was the district attorney. He was a big dark man with a broad face, and a frown that never came out of his forehead. He looked frightfully severe, but I soon found out he was really quite easy going, much more so than father, and often I could get around Mr. Dingley when father, for all his being pleasant, wouldn't have given an inch. But father said he had to be very stern, or other people would spoil me. By that he meant not so much Mr. Dingley, who was the same to everybody, as Señora Mendez, who had been mother's greatest friend. She had been a New England girl, who, in the early days of California, had married a Spanish gentleman. She was lovely to me. It was at her house that I went to my first ball. Except the Fergusons, hers was the only house in the city with rooms large enough to dance in, and that ball is still the most dazzling I can remember. I wore a rose-colored tulle skirt with a peasant waist of rose-colored satin, and father, for a great surprise, had given me a pair of pink silk stockings. No other girl in town had such a beautiful thing, and in the dressing room they would not let me go down until I had shown them. The lighted dancing rooms and all the strange people and my tall partners made me nearly die of shyness, but I danced 2 large holes in the toes of my lovely stockings, and afterward father teased me and said he found he had suddenly become very popular with the young men. He had never been so called upon in his life. But most of our parties were not such elegant affairs, though sometimes they were even more fun, like the Fergusons' calico ball, where I wore my grandmother's gingham and prunella shoes, or the party the summer Light Guards gave, which was the prettiest of all on account of the young men's uniforms, and the way we sat around the little refreshment tables between dances with our mothers and our partners, the band playing all the time, and every one so gay. I sometimes went to as many as 4 parties a week, so that in the morning it was all I could do to be up in time to see breakfast on the table. I found out that being a housekeeper meant more than long petticoats and pouring tea. It meant being all over the house before 10 in the morning, for, as Abby said, a house has a lot of strings to it, and unless you keep them all tied up tight, something's going to sag. But I enjoyed my authority of the house, and my liberty abroad seemed like license to me. I felt launched on a wide sea of life. The city itself was changed to my new horizon. It was larger, more complicated, with more masts in the harbor, new streets and horse-car lines, and every one moved about in it like the pieces of a Chinese puzzle. The friends who had lived close about us had all moved westward or southward with the trend of the city, and between Telegraph and Chestnut Street hills there were some very fine houses. I was often running over there to see Hallie or Estrella, and my shortest way lay past the convent that stood a little apart in the middle of the settlement. Next to it, but facing on another street, was a house which had been built at the same time as the convent. The convent wall came up at its back. On the other 3 sides was a high fence. Over the fence only the upper story could be seen, and it had a look so still and closed up that it brought back to me that feeling of mystery the city used to give me as a child. But I never noticed or wondered about it particularly until one day when I saw an open carriage waiting in front of the steps. While I was looking, a woman came out of the gate and got into the carriage. She was Spanish, I saw at a glance, and big, and all in sweeping black. But instead of being dark, she was tawny, with a wonderful glow of copper-colored hair through her black lace veil, and in all my life I had never seen a creature move so gracefully as she. It was like watching a beautiful cat. I asked Estrella Mendez who she was, and Estrella blushed and said she did not know. And when I asked was she sure, because I knew the woman was Spanish, Estrella got quite angry and said she wasn't supposed to know all the Spanish people in the city, and especially if they didn't have husbands. That surprised me, for the woman had looked quite like a great lady, and when I went home I spoke to father about it. He said he feared Estrella was right. We none of us knew the Spanish woman. "But," I told him, "she looks like a queen, and she has a beautiful carriage." He laughed and said yes, she had money, and a good deal of influence in high places, but the women she knew were not the sort of people I would care about, and he finished by saying I was a silly child to go staring at strange "greasers." I did hate to have father laugh at me, but I couldn't help looking at her slyly when now and then I saw her about the city. She was like no other Spanish woman I had ever seen. Most of them were as white as callas, powdered over the lashes, but you could see the strong bloom of her skin even through the thick coat of rice powder she wore, and her lashes were lovely. I noticed that because she kept them half down and looked out through them. But the most fascinating thing about her was the way she moved, like something flowing, and once in a shop I heard her speak, and her voice was so attractive, sweet and rather thick, with such a gracious, petting sound to it. But she was always alone. With it all she seemed to be mysterious, like her quiet closed-up house. I got to making up stories about her, and sometimes in my room, in front of my mirror, I practiced looking out through my lashes. But it was a nuisance, for though they weren't short, they curled back so suddenly that it didn't look right, and my hair being blonde and flying into corkscrews, and my being so little and forgetting not to step on my flounces when I tried to sweep, altogether made it rather a failure, in spite of the black lace shawl. But though I thought about her I didn't say anything more to father or Abby, because questions that hadn't bothered them when I was little seemed to worry them now. Father was forever talking of the things I must not do. One was not to be about in the neighborhood alone. It was changing, and above all never to go over to Dupont Street, for that, he said, was getting to be notorious, and he hated to have it so near. It was only a block below us, but it seemed to me very quiet, and though Mr. Rood's gambling house was on the corner, there was never any noise there, only such fine young men, and some that I knew, all the time going in and out of it. But that pleased father least of anything, and he asked me how would I like to move over to the North Beach district where all my friends were. Talking it over with Hallie and Estrella, I liked the idea very much. But when I came home again to the old house, with the long windows, and the palm, and the long steps up to the conservatory, and all the rooms I knew, the very idea that I could have thought for a moment of going away from it gave me a lump in my throat. So I had to tell father that I couldn't. He pinched my cheek and said, "Next year, then." And so we stayed on. This was in February, 1865. End of the prologue.